One of the problems in technical fields is that they have terms that sound self-explanatory in art. And I'm fairly sure that there are a lot of people in the world who think they understand the theory of relativity. Because the theory of relativity, they don't understand the mathematical details. But the theory of relativity says everything is relative. I understand that. And of course, that's not what the theory of relativity says. Similarly with terms in economics, and in particular with market failure, which is the term that I'm going to be talking about, because I am going to argue that market failure is indeed a real problem, but it is not about markets. It exists on markets, but it exists in many other contexts as well. It's fundamentally a problem with human beings interacting with human beings. And I want to explain why market failure is a legitimate argument against laissez-faire, but to argue that it is an even stronger argument against the alternatives to laissez-faire. So that rather than claiming that market failure doesn't exist, I want to claim it does exist, but on net is an argument on our side, although not entirely. And let me start with a simple example of market failure, but one that we don't usually think of as economics, except for those of us with a very broad idea of economics. And I want you to imagine that you are one of a line of thousands of men. It's 1,000 years ago, roughly. And you're one of a line of thousands of men with spears. And you're pointing the spears in that direction. And the reason is that coming at you are thousands more men on horseback, and they have lances. And you do a very quick cost-benefit calculation. And you say, if all of us hold our ground and plant our pikes, with luck, we can stop their charge. And if we stop their charge, some of us will die, but most of us will live. If we try to run away, horses run faster than we do, so I should stand. I'm sorry, I made a mistake. I said we. I don't control him and him. I only control me. If everybody else stands and I run, one fewer person out of thousands has very, very little effect on whether they stop the charge, and I won't be one of the ones who gets killed. If everybody else runs, my only chance is to run first. So whatever the other people are going to do, it is in my rational interest to run. We all do that calculation, we all run, and most of us die. Welcome to the dark side of rationality. So that to me, the right way of understanding market failure as a general idea is that it describes situations where individual rationality does not lead to group rationality. And there are lots of other examples. If you've studied economics, you are probably familiar with the prisoner's dilemma. The prisoner's dilemma is a two-person market failure. Both prisoners are people familiar with prisoner's dilemma? It's sort of a standard thing in our classes. Yeah. Each person is acting correctly, he's acting rationally, he's maximizing his welfare, and they would both be better off if they didn't. And there are lots of other examples. Burning coal in London 100 years ago and creating London fogs and so forth. It's worth noting that whether or not individual rationality leads to group rationality sometimes depends on the particular rules of the game that you're playing under. And that means that if you're creating institutions or designing a firm or doing almost anything, one of the things you want to think about is whether you can engineer around market failure, whether you can change the way it's done so that this will not be the case. And ultimately, market failure comes from the fact that some of the costs and benefits of my actions go to other people. I don't take account of them in my decision, and therefore, even if the gain to me is positive, the gain to us could be negative. You're doing the same thing, so we're both worse off. And my favorite example of engineering around it is the camel puzzle, the camel riddle. And it's the following story, which I'm fond of. Two Bedouins are riding their camels through the Arabian desert, a few miles from an oasis. And one of them starts complaining about how slow his camel is. He says, this beast, this turtle, is the slowest camel in all the deserts of Arabia. And the other Bedouin says, you think your camel is slow? You should have to ride my camel, which is slower than any other camel that has ever been born in the history of mankind. So they get into an argument about whose camel is slower. And finally they make a bet. And the bet is that whichever camel gets to the oasis last, its owner wins the bet. And the other must pay him a golden dinar. Well, if you think about it, you can see what's going to happen. One of them goes slowly, and the other one goes more slowly. The other goes more slowly still because they both want to win the bet. And an hour later, there are two Bedouins sitting their camels stock still in the middle of the... you want me to stop for you? In the middle of the Arabian desert, in the hot, blazing sun, with the oasis a mile away. And at this point, a wise man comes by. And the wise man says, "What are you two idiots doing? Sitting your camels stock still in the blazing sun a mile from the oasis." And the two Bedouins get off their camels to explain the problem to him. And the wise man says two words to them, and they leap back on the camels and ride off for the oasis as fast as they can. What are the two words? How do we change their incentives? Switch camels. Okay. Each one gets on the other one's camel. Now he wants to go fast, not slowly, and now they get to the oasis. All right? So that's sort of a neat little pocket example of the point that whether you're stuck in a market failure, sometimes, not always, but sometimes is something that you can control. Now, economists, most of whom are not anarchists, economists, at least in the U.S., I think tend to be more friendly to the market than other academics, but not nearly friendly enough. And economists offer market failure as an argument against laissez-faire. That economists tend to assume individuals are rational. In fact, I would say that the definition of economics is it's the way of understanding behavior that starts from the assumption that individuals have objectives and tend to choose the correct way of achieving, which is what I think rationality means. And so it's tempting to say, well, if everybody is rational, then we don't need any laws or restrictions. That just solves the problem because everybody will act in his own interest. We're all better off. And market failure shows that that's not true. That under some circumstances it'll happen, but under some circumstances everybody acting in his own interest gives you a perverse result, an undesirable result. And that, it seems to me, is a legitimate argument. Probably you're familiar, one of the standard examples is the public good problem. A public good fundamentally is a good where the producer can't control who gets it. So I usually define it as a good where if it's produced at all, it will be available to all the members of a pre-existing group of people. There's a second half of the definition, which is, I think, less essential, namely that the cost of producing it does not depend on how many people consume it, like a radio broadcast. But I think that's really natural monopoly on the quantity dimension rather than something special. And if you think about it, public good does not, as non-economists tend to assume, mean a good the government produces. Governments produce lots of private goods, schooling, for example, and lots of public goods are privately produced. If you think about it, radio programs are privately as well as publicly produced, even though a radio program is a pure public good. I'll come back to that in a minute. A closely related problem, which you're probably all also familiar with, is externalities, where I take an action and some of the costs or some of the benefits go to other people. In all of these cases, we can't be sure that individual rationality on the free market will give us the right answer. Some of the problems can be and are solved. There are quite a lot of public goods privately produced. In the case of radio programs, some unknown genius thought up the idea of producing not one public good, but two. One of the public goods is called a radio program, and it has a positive cost of production and a positive value to the consumer. One of them is called an advertisement, and it has a negative cost of production because companies will pay the radio station to put the ad on, and often a negative value to the customer. You tie these two public goods tightly together and give away the bundle, and that's how private radio works. So that would be one example. One of the fairly common market solutions to externality problems is to put multiple activities under one roof. So if you say, look, if we have stores and parking lots, the parking lot makes it more attractive to shop at the stores, so that's an external benefit. So you have shopping malls where one firm provides the parking, rents out the stores, and thus has an incentive to consider in the parking it provides the value for the stores. And there are a lot of other examples. There's a fairly famous example in the literature involving bees and honey. An economist who, oddly enough, was named Mead, he actually got a Nobel Prize, though not for what I'm going to talk about, offered as an example of the sort of externality that could not be privately handled, the relationship between crops and bees that make honey. Because he said the bee, if you grow a crop that has flowers the bees can browse in, that makes the people who own the bees better off because their bees can produce more honey. But you can't use contract and property right because bees don't respect property rights. So you can't say to the bees, we will charge you 1/100 of a cent every time you cross into my flower garden. So Mead says, clearly this is not doable, so you can't have an efficient outcome. And it turned out that not only was the problem solved by contract, it has been solved by contract in that industry for as long as we have records, which in the US, where somebody did some work on it, was about 80 or 100 years. And the point is that while bees do not respect property rights, like the rest of us, they are lazy, and they prefer to do their browsing as close to the hive as possible. So the normal arrangement has been true for a long time, that at the point when the crops are producing flowers that the bees need to browse on, the beekeepers pay the farmers for permission to put their hives in the farmers' fields. Hives can be moved around. Furthermore, although Mead didn't realize it, there's also an externality in the other direction, because some crops are more productive if they're pollinated by bees. So at the time of the year when the crops need pollination, the farmers pay the beekeepers to put their hives in their fields. So that was sort of a neat example where what looked to an academic like an insoluble problem, in fact, had been solved long ago by practical people. All of these suggest that the problems of market failure on the private market may be less serious than they appear, but they do not mean that those problems don't exist. That the implication of this argument is that under laissez-faire, there will be goods that are worth producing that don't get produced, and there will be goods that are not worth producing that do get produced. If you have a good where a substantial part of the benefit goes to other people who I can't charge for it, then I may not produce it, even though including the whole benefit it's worth producing, vice versa if the cost goes to other people. And that implies that the laissez-faire market will give us a less good outcome than we would get if we had a perfectly wise and benevolent planner ordering things around. We have, however, a striking shortage of perfectly wise and benevolent planners. So the actual alternative to the market is not that, but it's political institutions of various sorts, democratic or monarchy or dictatorship. A bunch of different versions have been tried. And if you think about it, just as the problem of market failure explains armies running away, it also explains why political institutions work very badly. If you think, the standard example is what economists who study political institutions refer to as rational ignorance. There is what I like to describe as the civics class model of democracy, the sort of simple model of democracy. And that is that the reason democracy works is that politicians have to do good things or they'll be voted out. The problem with this is that in order for that to work, the voters have to know whether the politicians are doing good things. And for some reason, politicians practically never announce that they're doing bad things. That a sensible politician, whatever he wants to do, will always find some explanation of why it's in everybody's interest. My standard example of this for the U.S. is that I don't think anyone has ever introduced a bill into Congress which says a bill to make farmers richer and city folk poorer. And yet every year we have a farm program which typically is designed to raise the price of agricultural products and thus to make farmers richer and consumers of food poorer. But with much better rhetoric to cover it. So the question is, why would a rational person choose to do all of the work necessary to figure out what the politician he's voting for or against is doing and whether it should be done? And you'd say, well, in order to get good politicians. But that trouble is that from the standpoint of the individual voter in a large society, the effect of his vote on the outcome is very, very close to zero. My rough estimate is that in a U.S. presidential election, your vote has about 1 chance in 5 million of deciding who wins, very roughly. And it is not worth bearing very much cost for 1 chance in 5 million of getting a better outcome. Now, it's true if what you're voting for is a politician who is good not just for you but for the country, then the benefit of electing the right one is very large. It may be much more than 5 million. But almost all that benefit is going to other people. It's a public good. so you don't include that in your calculation. So the implication is that in a democracy, unless it's very small, individual voters will mostly be rationally ignorant. And I sometimes, when I'm teaching a class in the U.S., ask my students how many of them know the name of their representative. And generally about half of them do. And it's really hard to watch what a politician is doing if you don't know what his name is. So that's one example of a market failure which undercuts what's supposed to be the central control mechanism for democratic polity. Let me give you a different example. People who are arguing for government often claim that the market is short-sighted and only looks at the bottom line today, whereas politicians can look much further. And the truth is almost exactly the opposite. That if you think about rational behavior in a market with secure property rights, it pays not only to plan for the future, but to plan beyond your own life. Because imagine, for example, that there is some valuable kind of tree, say a black walnut tree, or maybe ebony, which is really expensive, that's slow growing. And you're 60 years old, and if you buy some land and plant it with these trees, it'll be 50 years before they're ready to harvest. You're not going to live to 110. So we might say, well, why would anybody plant those trees? Or maybe only young people would. But the answer is, I will plant the trees. And in 20 years, when I'm 80 and think I need some money, I will sell 20-year-old trees to another entrepreneur who is now 20 years closer to harvest. Thus, I get the money now. He can, in another 20 years, if he likes, sell them to a third person. So that means that the individual rational behavior leads to planning far into the future and even beyond your own lifetime. There is, however, a critical condition for this to work, and that is secure property rights. Suppose we have secure property rights, and suppose market real interest rates are 2%. In that case, my investment in the trees has got to pay me more than 2%, at least 2%, to be worth doing. Suppose, however, that I know that every year there's a 5% chance that some robber will come onto my land and cut down my partly grown trees to sell them. In that case, I've got to make enough more each year to compensate for the risk of that loss. Similarly, if I know that there's a 5% chance each year that the government will decide that black walnut trees are a national resource and selfish private individuals like me shouldn't own them, the government should own them. Either way, I will be much less willing to plan into the future the more insecure my property rights are. Politicians have insecure property rights. So that a rational politician will not bear political costs today for political benefits 60 or even 20 or even 10 years in the future, because he knows that his political power is not secure private property, that by the time those benefits occur, somebody else will be president, somebody else will get the credit, and therefore, although politicians talk about future planning, what they actually do pretty clearly is to worry about what the unemployment rate and the inflation rate will be at the next election, and that's rational behavior for them. It's also, I should say, rational for them to pretend to care about the future, because the nice thing about the future is the voters can't see it. And the classic case of this would be Stalin, that Stalin had a problem. It was obvious to everybody living in Russia that things were terrible, that they were poor, they were very crowded. Now, only some of them got to see things elsewhere, so it may not have been that obvious to many of them. But Stalin's solution, that was say, yes, it's true we're poor, but the reason we're poor is that we are building the industrial society for the future. That when our 5-year plans are over, a few 5-year plans, we will be as rich as the Americans, and we're making sacrifices now in order that we can do that. And the nice thing about that story is that the people in Russia can't see 10 years or 20 years in the future. They can't see that it's a lie, whereas they could see if he said, look, you all have nice houses and good food and plenty of clothes and so forth. And I think the same thing is true in less extreme societies, that when politicians say that they are doing things for the future, almost certainly these are things where there is some good political reason to do it now, and they are simply trying to get credit for so that people won't object to the costs. And I suppose one example in the U.S. would be the biofuels program, where we actually had a very prominent American politician who admitted that he now realized he had supported that program because he was running for president, and there was a early vote in an agricultural state, and the biofuels program turns agricultural products into alcohol. That bids up the price of agricultural products, so it's very popular with the farm interests whose votes he wanted. But the story he was telling was that we needed to do it because it reduced supposedly carbon dioxide output or made us independent of the evil Arabs or something of that sort. So I think that's a fairly common. Another fairly familiar example is the problem of information costs and drug regulation. That if a new drug is brought out and is permitted to be brought out by the FDA, the regulators in the US, and has very bad side effects, of which thalidomide is the classic example, the official who let it be brought out is finished with his career, and other people above him will suffer serious losses. If a drug is stalled for a few years, if he keeps saying we need more evidence, and the result is that 100 people die who would have lived if that drug would be available, nobody will know that. Because those deaths are statistical deaths, they're a lower cure rate for most drugs. Most drugs don't instantly cure you, they just are more likely you'll survive than with the older drug. That's not going to be visible. So given that there are information costs for the individual voters, it is rational for the regulator to be too cautious, for the regulator to say, unless I'm absolutely certain, I won't allow. Let me go on to a discussion of an economic analysis of how the political market really works. Think of it not in terms of voting for good guys, but of interest groups who are offering votes, campaign contributions, various other things to politicians in order to pass the laws they want. And each interest group itself faces a public good problem. Because if the auto companies make contributions to congressmen which result in a tariff on autos, all of the auto companies will benefit whether or not they contributed to buying that law. So that means that you have a problem of how do you get the money. In general, it is easier for small groups to solve public good problems than for large groups. So if you have only 4 auto companies plus 1 auto union, it's relatively easy for them to get together and say, look, I'll put in this much, you put in this much, you put in this much. And if you refuse, we won't do it, we won't get our tariff. So that means that if the auto tariff benefits the industry by $20 billion, they can probably raise at least $2 billion and maybe more in order to buy that law. The auto tariff, of course, also hurts people. It hurts all buyers of cars because it makes them more expensive. And less obviously, it hurts all producers of export goods because the less we import, the less we'll export. However, the people who are hurt are a very dispersed interest group. They're basically the whole population pretty nearly. It is very hard when you have several hundred million people, each of whom is losing $10 or whatever due to the tariff, maybe more than that, to raise any money from them, because each of them will correctly say, just like my men lined up at the beginning of this talk, that whether I chip in will have very little effect on whether we stop the tariff, and if you people manage to stop the tariff, I'll get the benefit of cheap cars as a result. So a predictable result of market failure theory on the political market is that governments will tend to transfer from dispersed interest groups to concentrated interest groups. That explains why tariffs exist, because the economics of foreign trade was worked out, as you may know, about 200 years ago by David Ricardo, so-called theory of comparative advantage. And one of its implications is that with some special exceptions, imposing a tariff hurts the country that imposes it, as well as the countries it's imposed against. Now, you can imagine with enough ingenuity cases where that isn't true, but those cases don't correspond to the tariffs you actually get. That there is the theoretical infant industry tariff. U.S. autos and steels are not infant industries, they're senile industries. And in fact, if you think through the logic, if people are curious, I could discuss it later, there are reasons why senile industries are more likely to get special advantages than infant industries are. The overall conclusion is that while market failure indeed exists on the private market, it is endemic on the political market. And the reason is that market failure comes from people making decisions where they aren't bearing the cost of benefits. And that describes almost all decisions on the political market. not only the decision of the voter, where if he votes for the right guy, that affects everybody, if it has any effect at all, but the legislator and the judge. My favorite horror story on this is a U.S. law case quite a while ago, which involved the live polio vaccine, before the modern polio vaccine. There was a polio vaccine which had a very small probability, I think about 1 in a million, of giving you polio. And somebody, either he was vaccinated and got it, or his son was vaccinated and he got it, I don't remember, but somebody gets polio. And the question was whether the drug company was liable. And the position of the court was the drug company was not negligent in having a risk of getting polio because that was what was regarded as unavoidably hazardous. So there was no known way of immunizing against polio without that risk. The question was whether they should have tried harder to make sure that people receiving the inoculations knew of the risk. They told the nurses and doctors about the risk, but they did not monitor the nurses and doctors to make sure they told the patients. And the court argued, not unreasonably, that whether or not informing people was negligent depended on whether a person might reasonably decide to decline the immunization if he knew of the risk. They then compared the risk of getting polio from the immunization with the annual risk of getting polio if you're not immunized. All right, the immunization lasts for a lifetime. So their result was, roughly speaking, I'm going by memory so I don't swear my numbers here right. It was, roughly speaking, you have 1 chance in a million of getting polio if you get vaccinated. You have 1 chance in 900,000 of getting polio this year if you're not vaccinated. Therefore, the risks are about the same. Therefore, somebody might decide not to be vaccinated. But in fact, the comparison they should have made was that 1 chance in 900,000 multiplied by 30 or 40 years, because you could get polio any year, which would give an overwhelming advantage to getting the vaccination. I like to describe it as a mistake that a smart high school student should have been ashamed of making. And it's a mistake which almost certainly killed thousands of people, because the result of that case was that for a while you got fewer vaccines put on the market because the makers of vaccines were afraid of being sued for this sort of problem. Eventually, Congress intervened and immunized the drug makers against liability of that sort. But delaying vaccines for even a couple of years is going to result in a lot of unnecessary deaths. The judges who made that mistake never suffered any penalty. They could never be sued by people, by either the drug company or anyone else for their mistake. So I think that's a fairly clear example of a different part of the political system where people are not actually bearing the costs of their decisions. And I think this explains why market failure does a better job of predicting political outcomes than it does of predicting market outcomes. That private radio ought not to exist, if you just look at the market failure argument, and yet it does. On the other hand, governments ought to transfer wealth from dispersed interest to concentrated interest, and they do. Gary Becker has an interesting observation about foreign policy. And his claim is that the countries of the world divide into 2 groups. There are countries where farmers are a very small minority of the population, like the US and Europe. And in those countries, the function of farm policy is to make farmers richer and other people poorer, because farmers are a concentrated interest group. There are countries where the farmers are the mass of the population, mostly third world countries. And there, the purpose of farm policy is to drive down the price of food in order to buy the support of the urban mob at the cost of the dispersed peasantry. And I only know of one exception. New Zealand, as far as I can tell, neither specially taxes nor specially subsidizes farmers. But it's a pretty good rule. So in general, market failure analysis seems to do a pretty good job of predicting actual real world. Let me go on to point out that market failure is a problem not just on the private market and for armies and on the political market, but in lots of other contexts. And I will give you a daily life example that some of you may have experienced. And that is, assume you have got a roommate or a wife or somebody with whom you are sharing food and living quarters, and both of you cook. And so you decide it's fair that we alternate. I cook half the time, he cooks or she cooks half the time. And then there are 2 ways you could organize it. One of them is that one day I cook and you clean up, and the next day you cook and I clean up. And the other is one day I cook and I clean up, and the next day you cook and you clean up. They're equally fair. They're both even divisions. The question is, which one should you do? And it's a question which I only want to put to people who cook. People have, you require some information, as in much of economics, of the relevant technology in order to apply economic theory to make sense of the world. So which should you do?
Cook and clean up.
Cook and clean up, because?
Cooking, you can potentially ruin the whole kitchen, so then you clean up.
That's right. That is to say...
I mean, you're internalizing the cost.
That's right. That's right. There are a bunch of decisions in when you cook. What are you going to make? Do you make a one-pot meal, which makes almost no mess, or something very elaborate? Do you wash out one thing while something else is coming to a boil? You can think of a whole lot of decisions which affect the amount of mess. And consequently, you will have an incentive to properly take account of the effect if you make it an internal rather than external cost. So that's one simple example. Let me give a different example from my profession, which is teaching, but also the one that you're consumers of. And that's what I like to describe as the silent student problem. I'm explaining some point in economics, and I give a perfectly clear explanation, which nobody could fail to follow. And I then say, all right, did everybody follow that? And nobody says anything. So obviously they understand it, and I go on to the next point, and only discover my mistake when I grade the final exam. What's going on? The rational student, who doesn't understand it, says if I say I don't understand it, maybe everyone else does understand it, and I'll look stupid to the other students, which I don't like doing. I'll look stupid to the professor, and maybe he'll grade me down if he has some adjustment for how well people are doing in class for that. And any benefit from learning more will be shared with all the other students. So all the students stay silent. And I have a solution to this problem, not one that I've implemented. I'm a theorist, not a practical person from that standpoint. And my solution is you arrange the classroom so that at every seat there's a small, unobtrusive button on the floor, which you can push with your foot without anybody knowing whether you're pushing it or not. And on the back wall of the classroom, there is a sign which shows how many buttons are being pushed. And so when I come to the critical point and say, now will everybody who understood my explanation of the principle of comparative advantage, please push your button. And the number 2 appears on the screen, and I go back and explain it. So that's a case, again, where I'm trying to engineer around market failure in my own industry. Similarly, if you were creating a firm, something I know very little about, except that I observe that some firms seem to work much better than others, a lot of what you want to try to do is to figure out ways of setting it up so that the reward people get depends on the contribution they make, depends on how much they increase the firm's revenue or profits, basically. And there are various ways you can try to do that. And where that's impossible, you're going to have some kind of centralized control, the equivalent of Stalin. It works better for small numbers than for big numbers, and try to find ways of at least minimizing the costs and problems. Notice that throughout this discussion, I am being consistent in the assumptions I make. I am assuming rational self-interested behavior by businessmen, by politicians, by voters, by husbands and wives, even by students. Even by professors, though I didn't get that. And self-interested does not mean selfish in the narrow sense. One of the things some self-interested people may choose to do is one of their objectives might be helping poor people or contributing to knowledge or anything else. But only that individuals have objectives. They aren't all the same, and consequently there is a potential conflict as each person acts to achieve his objectives, whatever they are. That's basically what I wanted to say, and I concluded long ago that the nice thing about answering questions is that when you're answering questions, you know at least one person in the audience is interested in what you're talking about. So I will now stop and take questions, or anything at all.
I have a question.
Yes.
What do you think about monarchies as ways to secure property rights into...
Monarchy has an obvious advantage, but also some disadvantages. The obvious advantage is that in a well-functioning monarchy, you have secure political property rights. So the monarch knows that even if he has to have less luxury this year because he's spending money on some useful investment, he and his people will get the benefit of that 10 years or 20 years down the road. And to some degree, you can even plan beyond your life because people care about their children. Figures his son will also be monarch. That's an advantage. And the disadvantage is that there are very limited mechanisms for making it in the interest of the monarch to do what is in the interest of the population. Somewhat similar arguments apply to dictatorship in general. I don't know if any of you read historical novels, but there's a very good historical novelist by the name of Mary Renault who wrote about ancient Greece. And one of her novels is really about tyranny. As you may know, tyrant was not a negative term in Greek politics 2,500 years ago. It was a descriptive term. A tyrant basically meant a popular dictator. And in her novel, the protagonist of the novel is a professional poet. The novel is called The Praise Singer. And he therefore meets and deals with various rulers. He's a poet, he's a real person. That is, obviously she's inventing a large part of the story. But he is a poet, only one piece of his verse has survived. I don't know if any of you are familiar with it, but the translation is, "Stranger, if you come to Sparta, tell that here, obedient to the law, we fell." It's the marking on Thermopylae. And in the course of the story, he observes three different tyrannies. And the first one, the tyrant is corrupt but competent. He's the ruler of a Greek island off the coast of Asia Minor, I think. And he is living high off the hog. He's consuming a lot. But in order for him to live high off the hog, his island has to be rich, so he's got stuff to grab. So he does quite a good job of running the island. And when he dies, it's a catastrophe. Things fall apart. The second one, the ruler is not only competent but benevolent. And this is the tyrant of Athens, early in Athenian history. And as Renault tells the story, and I don't know what her basis for it is, he was the younger lover of Solon, the man who wrote the Athenian law. And as he explains to the protagonist, when Solon made the law, everybody approved of everything but one thing. Everybody wanted something in the law to change to advantage himself. Solon left Athens. He said, if I'm not here, they can't make me change it. They kept his laws. They keep them still. I see to that, who could have given them laws they would like less well. So he's been basically kept honest by the memory of his dead lover. And he does a very good job of running Athens, and he dies. And his sons succeed. And for a little while it goes on inertia, so to speak, and then it slides downhill. And so I think Renault's view basically was that tyranny is the best form of government, provided you have the right tyrant. But there's no way of doing it. There's a comment that's often attributed to Winston Churchill. I don't know if he really said it, which is that democracy is the worst form of government ever invented by the mind of man, except for all the others that have been tried from time to time. And people usually interpret that as an endorsement of democracy. But it isn't. It's a critique of government. If it's really true that the very best form of government works very badly, which I think is correct, that's a reason to do as little as possible through government or as much as possible through non-governmental means. But no, I wouldn't argue that monarchy is always worse than democracy or always better, or that tyranny is always worse than either of the other two. I mean, the tyrant, after all, has one thing to be said for him, and that is he was at least able enough to seize power. One of my current projects is a book on legal systems very different from ours. And one of the things I looked at a little bit was the Ottoman Empire. And it's quite an interesting story, and I think, I'm not sure this is right, but I think the following is true. That in the early centuries of the Ottoman Empire, the succession mechanism was fratricide. That when a sultan died, those of his sons who wanted to be sultan fought it out. Each of them with his supporters and with armies and politics and so forth. And one of them won, and he became sultan. And on the one hand, that's a very expensive succession mechanism, because you get people killed. On the other hand, it's a mechanism which selects for that son who's best at winning wars. During the period when that was true, the Ottoman Empire was expanding. I think it's roughly true that the point at which they gave up on that, and at which the sultan became, in effect, a figurehead living very richly in a palace, with other people really running the empire, is also about the point when the Ottoman Empire stopped expanding. So that's sort of an interesting example of sort of trying to figure out why institutions worked or didn't work. Now, of course, work is a funny term. Many of us would rather not have expanded, but from their standpoint, that was presumably what they wanted. Other questions?
Yeah, I made a question.
Sure.
In regards to a comparison between market failure and the failure of catalaxy, when you have, when you have to produce the norms at a local operation in a normal situation. My question is, we actually said that securing property rights is a fundamental assumption in order to have a market working in a good way, right? And we probably need some basic norms, some minimal norms that allow us to cooperate with each other and to produce good outcomes, right? And my question is, do you think this kind of norms, this basic norm, actually be produced by the market, or do they require some kind of legislator to produce generally this kind of basic minimum norms?
Well, that's really the talk that I gave yesterday,
Okay.
which was about law without government. And let me take sort of the beginning part of that talk, because I think it's interesting on its own. And that is that people often argue that property is a creation of government. And so when you complain that the government is violating your property rights, they say, don't be silly, you wouldn't have any property rights without government. And it's not true. And it's demonstrably not true. And the reason it's demonstrably not true is that not only does private property predate government, it predates the human species. That if you look at territorial behavior in animals, which is common in not all animals, but quite a lot of different fishes and birds, especially, I think, some mammals. And the pattern of territorial behavior is that an individual animal somehow marks a piece of territory that he's claiming. And somehow he turns a switch in his head, as it were, such that he will now fight more and more desperately against the trespasser the further into his territory the trespasser comes. Unless the two animals are very different in strength, a fight to the death is a loss for both. So that means that if you, the trespasser, believe the claimant really has committed himself to fight you as hard as it takes, you back off. It's not worth trespassing. So that gives you a form of private property, a very limited form. It's not transferable. We don't have a lot of the details. But it is a form of private property that does not depend on humanity, language, state, or anything of the sort. I want to argue that in making sense of ordinary human societies, they involve the same thing happening in a much more complicated way. And my standard story for this is to imagine you live in some suburban area where the government is not very competent. And one day your next door neighbor says, I've been thinking that taking my trash to the dump is a real nuisance. So I've decided instead I'm just going to dump it over the fence onto your property. And you know and I know that getting the local authorities to do anything about it, proving to them what I've been doing and getting them to stop me, is going to be much more trouble than it's worth. But I got a deal off. Pay me $10 a month and I won't do it. Why do you not accept that deal? Why? I predict that you will not accept the deal. People generally will not accept the deal. The question is why. And the answer is the same answer as why the bird doesn't retreat. That you have turned a switch in your brain, as it were. You have got a commitment strategy, which is that there are certain rights you think you have, one of which is not paying tribute to your neighbor. And you are willing to bear costs, not infinite costs, but costs much larger than what seems to be at stake in order to defend those rights. And it's true on the international basis. Sort of the example I like would be the Falklands War. Britain, for a bunch of barren islands near the South Pole, Britain risked its only aircraft carrier, its navy is much smaller than it used to be, bore very large costs, because they are committed to, if you seize our property, we'll fight you. And it makes sense to be committed to that, because, Spain might like Gibraltar, somebody else might like something else. So I think I think of it as the puzzle of in what sense you are ever out of a Hobbesian state of nature. Because the Hobbesian state of nature is supposed to be a war of each against all. Why aren't we doing that? That you say, well, the police will arrest you if you kill somebody. Why would they arrest you? The police are people too. Why aren't they just one more player in this war of each against all? And I think the answer is that in a functional society, there is an elaborate network of mutually recognized commitment strategies, such that everybody knows what things they can do to other people and can't do without causing out of proportion negative responses. And as long as most of the time I correctly perceive your commitments, that works. And it gives a structure and an order which is not really coming from government at all. Now, there are some predictions that follow from this. One of them is you're likely to have conflict on cultural boundaries because different societies may see things differently, and therefore what you see as a perfectly reasonable commitment, I think you're just bluffing because nobody would be committed to that, and so forth, which I think is one prediction of this way of looking at it. If people are curious, most of my writing is on my webpage, and there's an article called A Positive Account of Property Rights, which is expanding these ideas. It's not really about property rights. It's really about rights, but it was written for a conference on property rights, which is why I put it that way. And I think it's sort of a useful way of thinking about how human societies work in terms of commitment strategies.
Just one more thing. The point is that I agree with you in some sense of a lot of things you say about this, but the point is that we have legislation, right? And in some sense, legislation arises kind of organically, to use Menger's word, in a kind of spontaneous way, right? So the point is that...
But of course, robbery arises spontaneously.
Yeah, that is the point. So my problem is the distinction between spontaneity in origin and actual spontaneity of an order, right?
I'm not sure I understand the distinction. Some things might be spontaneous and bad.
Of course. I mean...
so what is your distinction? What are the two categories?
No, okay, the problem is that the point is that you may have institutions that arises in a spontaneous way, that arises organically and that produce bad consequences.
Yes.
And actually evolves in non-spontaneous ways, such as, you're kind of obeying a state of nature, you have normal state of nature, which people can cooperate with normal norms and cooperating in a good way, producing good outcomes, and then you have a bad evolution of disorder in which you...
And how do you switch from one to the other?
That is the problem.
There is a book that you might want to read, which I read a long time ago, so I'm going by memory, called The Moral Basis of a Backward Society. And it was written by Edward Banfield, who was a fairly prominent political scientist, also somebody I knew, who had lived both in a village in Italy and in a village in America. I think his wife was born in America, but of Italian parents, and so he had interest in Italy. I know that their cat was called Michi. His description, my guess is the village was in southern Italy from the description, though I don't remember what he said, that both of them were equilibrium. That in the Italian village, nobody trusted anybody. And that was rational, because if you did trust people, they'd cheat you. In the American village, people trusted each other. And that was rational, because if you didn't trust people, you'd miss opportunities to get useful things done, because they, in fact, were trustworthy. So that sort of is a political scientist talking about this difference. But how do you switch them is a very interesting question. I think one way it may sometimes happen is when you have small subgroups that among themselves have the desirable set of norms. So if you have a new religion, let's say, or a group of migrants from some other ethnicity, and they trust each other. There's a very interesting exchange between David Hume and Adam Smith on the question of established religion. That Hume, as you may know, was widely believed to be an atheist. In fact, Smith got in a good deal of trouble because he gave a description of Hume's deathbed. And Hume did not seem particularly scared about dying or going to hell or anything of the sort, and people thought he should have been. He didn't believe in God. Hume was in favor of established religion. And Hume's argument was that the established church bribed the indolence of the clergy. That if the individual preachers had to make their living by getting people enthusiastic about their religion, that would cause conflict, religious conflict in the society. Whereas with an established church in England, the way a preacher might got a good living was to give boring lectures in Latin with lots of classical allusions, thus demonstrating to the local nobleman who had control over giving the favors out that he was a good, educated sort of person, and instantly putting the villagers to sleep. And so Hume said this is a good thing. And Smith's reply was no, on the contrary, without an established religion, each religious sect has an incentive to monitor its own members in order to maintain its reputation. And therefore, he really was talking about a version of your question, that each small religious group knows that if one of its members cheats people outside, it'll get a bad reputation, so it puts pressure on its members not to do it. So I think all of these are interesting examples. There's sort of an economic puzzle that this may be relevant to, and that is it seems to me not uncommon for some particular small industry to be effectively monopolized by one ethnic group. So that I think it may have been donut shops, I'm not sure. It was something like that in Los Angeles, and I don't remember what they were, but they were all something, and something obscure. The Serbians. They're not Serbians, but it was something like that. And one explanation of that is that within that group, you've got a network of social pressures that you want your son to marry somebody else's daughter from the same ethnic group. If you have a bad reputation, they won't want to marry into your family. And that therefore, within such a group, you get effective non-governmental enforcement of good behavior. So maybe one answer is to infiltrate, as it were, to But I really don't know. I mean, I think it's a very interesting question, but it's not a technology that I really understand very well or can tell you how to use. Other?
I have a question,
Good.
maybe quite different from his question. I want to know if what do you think about the role of antitrust laws in keeping markets more efficient? Because there are a lot of economists pro-market that thinks that antitrust laws could be very useful.
Could be very useful, perhaps. And in particular, not being willing to enforce contracts and restraint of trade might be useful. But my impression is that the U.S. history, at least, suggests that antitrust law is quite often used to prevent competition rather than to create it. Because if I want to establish a new firm in an industry, one way of doing is to sell below cost for a while in order that that customers will try out my product, which they don't know anything about, but then the other firms can accuse me of predatory pricing and may be able to get me into trouble. This is not my field, so I'm really not an expert on it. But my impression, at least, is that while it may be true that not enforcing cartel agreements produces net benefits, it's not clear to me that attempts to forcibly prevent natural monopoly make very little sense, because if you really have economies of scale such that one firm can produce cheaper than two firms, then you break up the one firm and one of the halves grows again and so forth. It's sort of a pointless effort. And I would have said that the main things you want to do in order to promote competition are first to have free trade, because the world is a bigger market than Italy or the United States. And second, not to have government regulations that are designed to cartelize industries. For example, as you probably know, in Milan, if you wish to drive a taxi cab, you must pay about 115,000 euros to get a permit to do so. Now, this may sound like a large sum for you, but I was just doing a blog post on the subject, so I looked up the figure for New York. And it's from $700,000 to $1 million for the equivalent, for what's called a medallion, the right to operate one cab. And there are a whole lot of other examples that when the U.S. regulated airlines, which we fortunately eventually stopped doing, the function of the regulation was to cartelize the industry. It was illegal for an airline to lower its fares without permission from the Civil Aeronautics Board. And when an airline wanted to lower its fares, the other airlines would complain that it shouldn't. It was illegal for an airline to fly a route they hadn't been flying before without permission from the Civil Aeronautics Board. And if an airline asked for permission to do that, the other airlines would say, we've got enough planes on that route, we don't need it anymore. Same pattern existed in trucking regulation. And both of those, I think trucking went away, certainly the airline went away. So I think there are lots of examples where government activity reduces competition, and that it makes a lot more sense to focus on those. But I do think that there's a legitimate argument that enforcing things like cartel agreements makes things worse, not better. And therefore it makes sense not to have the government enforce those laws. I don't know the situation in Italy, but certainly in the U.S., there's a lot of professional licensing, often making very little sense. So if you want to be an egg grader or an interior decorator, depending on the city and state, you have to pass a test or in some way get approved. The existing industry makes it hard for new people to come in. If you want to be a barber, I think it requires, 300 hours of classroom instruction, something like that. In some, depends on the city, but in some cities, to be allowed to cut hair. Now, of course, you're allowed to cut your own hair without any instruction at all. You can even cut your friend's hair. But if you want to set up a business as a barber, you have to go through all this worthless instruction. So anyway, so that way, I guess my view is that the main antitrust problem is governments promoting monopoly, not governments not breaking it. Let me, while I'm on the subject, give you an idea with regard to government antitrust policy from a friend of mine, Ami Glazer, who's an economist at University of California, Irvine. And it's a lot of fun. He's an interesting guy. And Ami has the following proposal for when the FTC does or doesn't approve a merger. Because one of the things that policy in the U.S. does is to say, if you have two large firms in the same industry that want to merge, they have to get permission, because we've got to decide whether they're creating a monopoly or not. And so Ami's idea is, when a merger is proposed, find out what the other firms in the industry think of it. And if the other firms are in favor of the merger, don't permit it. And if they're against it, do permit it. Do people see why that's the case? We've got two possibilities. One of them is the reason you merge is you're trying to create a monopoly, and you intend to reduce output, drive up prices, and it takes long enough for new firms to enter, you hope to make money. If that's right, the other firms in the industry will say, wonderful. We can produce all we want because we're not reducing it at those high prices. Yeah. The other possibility is that you want to merge because the two firms together can really produce better than one firm. Then the competitors won't like that, so they'll be against it. Now, of course, it doesn't work for very long because after a while the other firms find out what you're doing and they reverse their instructions. But I thought it was a clever idea.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. You talked about market failure as a case associated with higher risk premia that politicians should, in some sense, willing to, because when uncertainty arises, of course, you. And this uncertainty is due to the fact that you're uncertain about your future election. In some sense, you will. You will not involve an investment because of all these things. But I wonder if there is any case in any kind of government where remuneration of politicians is all linked to the future. This kind of contracts should eliminate.
You're asking, can you set up a governmental rule in which, in the interest of the politicians, to? I don't know. One interesting scheme that one person I know of came up with, which is related to this, is to sell citizenships. So suppose you say anybody can be a citizen of the U.S. who wants to, but we have a price. And the better the country is, the higher the price we're going to be able to command. We'll sell a certain number a year and see what the market sets the price. So I suppose if you have that system, and if you said that when a politician retired, he got sort of an annuity that consisted of a certain number of citizenships to sell, that might be a mechanism that would give him some incentive to try to make it good in the future. But it's hard to know how you get anything like a one-to-one correspondence. I should say part of his proposal was that existing citizens were free to sell their citizenships too, so that you would, and in fact, in his version, citizenship included a vote. So you could have takeover bids. You could imagine if only we had enough money, or maybe with a small country, that somebody buys up a whole lot of citizenships, votes out the government, puts in a better government. Now people will buy back at the citizenships at a higher price because the government's let it run. And that was sort of a clever idea of how you could try to apply the market approach of trying to discipline corporations to governments. But no, the answer is I don't at least know of a way of doing it. There are lots of clever ideas people thought up for trying to make political institutions work better. There's a taxing scheme which is designed to make people give a true account of how much they value an outcome. It doesn't solve rationalism, but the I'm trying to remember the name of it. Preference revealing taxes. There's a different name for it for the guy who invented it. And the basic idea is that you have some issue, and everybody votes a sum of money, which he claims is what it's worth to him to have it decided his way. And the decision goes wherever the sum of money is larger. But if the decision goes your way, if your vote made the difference, if without your vote it would have been 10 million to 9 million against, and you voted 2 million, so it's now 11 million to 10 million for, you owe a tax equal to the amount of your vote that was necessary to flip it, which is 1 million in that case. And it turns out that if you work through the logic of this situation, it always pays you to tell the truth. Because if you overestimate the value to you, the only time that has an effect is if the overestimate is necessary to flip it, in which case you're paying that overestimate, which is more than it's really worth to you if you were lying. Now, the trouble is that it's not stable against coalitions. Because if you have two people, each of whom votes $10 million, being sure that that's enough so that neither vote will be decisive. So it doesn't work in that context. But that's sort of one example of a clever person thinking up a way of doing that.
Yes, but with respect to contracts applied
Yes.
to politician remunerations, for instance, if we had a sort of kind of finance ministry which operates, just to make things simple, only through project finance, so where the kind of investment is well defined, you don't.
So you have a government agency which uses government money to invest in things.
Exactly. There's
Yes.
there are no
And
bureaucracies.
are the ministers the ones who lose money if the investment fails and gain money if it succeeds?
Yeah, I mean exactly.
Then why do you need a ministry for it? Won't there be private entrepreneurs willing to do exactly the same thing?
Because at the same time there's a cost associated with coordination, information. You can elect people to just to decrease the cost of coordination and rapid investment.
I'm not sure why having it done by government. That is, what powers do these government actors have that private actors don't have? There's got to be some reason why there's a difference between it being government and private.
I mean, well, for instance, theoretically, France points out that when making water services public, just now decided that there was too much cost in information regarding, to know the structure of the cost and the structure of the networks through which the water should flow in every house. So they basically came up with this idea.
But why would the government be any better at working out what the structure of feeding water to people would be than a private firm doing it would be?
Well, if there was a contract associated just with remuneration, they would run the investment only if they were pretty right about it.
But I'm still, maybe I'm just not understanding what you're saying, because I don't understand. Your government officials are something other than private businessmen. So what powers do they have that private businessmen don't have? And why do those powers make them do a better job rather than a worse job? Will they lose the money if the...
Yes.
So it's their own money, so then private businessmen can invest their own money. What is the advantage that the government agency has? You know, if you believe that you've got some mechanism for making governments do the right thing, then you could say we could have a government agency, and some other government agency decides what the benefits are, which are public good benefits, and therefore you can't capture privately. And then that other agency says, all right, your costs were $10 million, your revenues were $5 million, but you've produced $6 million worth of public good, so we'll give you $1 million. But of course, if they wanted to do that, if you really had a reliable agency to make that judgment, you could do it with private firms. You could just say, all right, any private firm that does something with positive externalities or with, that's, if you're familiar with the idea of a Pigouvian tax, the Pigouvian tax is usually thought of as a positive tax, but a Pigouvian subsidy is the same idea, and you would then say, all right, any private firm can produce water to people who wants to, but we've discovered that producing clean water reduces disease. That's a public good, so therefore we'll give a bounty to the water providers according to what the disease rate is in the area they're polluting water to. You could do that, but that depends on the higher level government agency having the right incentives to do so, and not saying, well, your firm contributed money to our opponent, so we'll decide that you didn't do anything good, and that firm contributed money to us, so we'll decide they get a large bonus.
Okay.
Look.
I had maybe another question. I just wanted to ask, what is your opinion on a recent book by Acemoglu, Why Nations Fail? I don't know if...
I haven't read it.
Okay.
There are many books I haven't read.
Okay. No, because there's a distinction between inclusive institutions and exclusive institutions. And he said that basically the Anglo-Saxon tradition has a tradition of inclusive institutions.
What are inclusive institutions?
They're basically institutions where the people in power can be voted out very fairly easily, and where there is a broad participation into the political process. While extractive institutions are institutions where they cannot be voted out, and their interest is to extract basically resources from the population. And in particular, I wanted to ask you, what is your opinion on the, let's say, the optimal size of a country?
My first published journal article was a theory of the size and shape of nations. Not optimal. It was predictive, not normative.
Predictive.
And it started out with a very simple puzzle that nobody else seemed to have noticed. And that was, when the Roman Empire fell, why did it break? Why wasn't the Roman Empire succeeded by other states of similar size? The Roman Empire was a very big state. And so I came up with an economic model in which the taxpayers are cattle, so to speak. That is, the government is saying, here is a piece of land that two different governments want. How much higher will our net tax revenue be if we have it? So they're not just doing the welfare of the people at all, just the welfare of the government. And I then explained why changes in what was available to be taxed would change the equilibrium size of nations and the shape. Because in particular, suppose what you're taxing is trade. You've got a trade route, a river, say. If there are multiple nations along the trade route, it pays each of them to overtax. Because when I raise my tolls, most of the cost is borne by you in reductions in your revenue. Right? Therefore, if the major source of revenue is trade, it pays to have large nations oriented along trade routes. If the main source of revenue is land, then there's no such effect. You get the same revenue, you can collect the same rent whether you have 10 countries or one country covering the land. And I argued that there were reasons why the collapse of the Roman Empire led to a sharp decrease of the east-west Mediterranean trade that had been a major revenue source, I think, for the Roman Empire, shifted land to the source of revenue, and it slid down to small countries. And then what happens after that? Various things happen. One of them is trade revives. But another thing that happens, especially in the 18th century, but also in the 14th and 15th century, is an increase in incomes. In the 14th century, it's due to the Black Death, which cut the population. Well, once incomes push well above subsistence, it becomes possible to get revenue by taxing humans. And the question is, if you want to tax humans, what limits your ability to do so? And what limits it is competition. What limits it is they could leave. And there are then basically three ways that a government can try to maximize the amount of money it can squeeze out of its population. One of them is just to be big, so that the borders are far away so people are reluctant to go. But that has other costs. One of them is to build a wall around you. That's what the Soviets tried to do. That has costs. The clever one is to draw your boundaries along ethnic and linguistic boundaries so that all the places your population wants to be are places you rule. And, oh, it's mine. Sorry. I think I had an alarm on it. And we normally associate linguistic nationalism as something that's happening in, I guess, the 18th and especially the 19th century, which I'm arguing is then following from the Second Agricultural Revolution and the Industrial Revolution, raising incomes. And it turned out that there was some similar pattern back in the 14th and 15th century when the Black Death had raised wages. So I do have, if you're interested, that paper is on my webpage, so you can read it.
What's the name again?
The web page first is
web.
daviddfriedman.com. David D, it's all one word, www.daviddfriedman.com. And you need the D, which is my middle initial, because if I had applied 3 months earlier, I could have gotten David Friedman, but I didn't. And it's called, I think, a theory of the size and shape of nations. But the optimum, I don't know.
I was thinking
really
about the
believe it.
European process of
Yes.
unification, and it looks like it is kind of deteriorating towards
the United States of Europe, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean,
That's a mistake.
2 days ago, the tax commissioner of right today, they approved the financial transaction tax, and the tax commissioner of the European Union said it is a great breakthrough because it allows common tax policies and a very bright future ahead.
I think the
so I'm thinking, how can
I think the ideal thing for the EU would be a free trade zone, but not a super government. And what I want the EU to do, which they clearly are not doing, is to make it clear that if countries break up, they will automatically allow the pieces into the EU. Because if you think of the situation of Catalonia or Scotland or even Lombardy, if it seceded from the main country, if it had a free entry to the EU, then it's not very destructive. It just means that, the government's separated out, but all the economic transactions are the same. And I gather the EU's actual position is that if such an area region secedes, it's got to reapply and it'll take a long time and so forth. And that's going to make it harder. And it seems to me that secession is one of the mechanisms by which you can make governments work not well, but a little bit better.
So, I mean, you're in general positive, favorable to the Scottish referendum, the Catalonian referendum. There's a wave of independence.
Up to them. I am only saying that it would make sense to set up things so that if the people in a region would be better off, they're able to do so without the large costs associated with being out of the EU. And the EU is not doing that, unfortunately. But no, I mean, free trade regions are great. But given a free trade region, there's much to be said for competition among governments, which is what the EU is now trying to stamp out gradually. Okay. Other questions?
There's a question,
Yes.
sir.
What do you think about the concept of too big to fail? Obviously, governments keep creating large centralized monsters, but is there any way in a completely free market that too big structures could arise?
I don't know about too big, but certainly in a private market, you can have private arrangements to avoid failure. So that my impression of the banking system in the U.S. prior to the Federal Reserve is that the private banks had arrangements with each other such that if there was a run on one bank, other banks would in various ways try to help avoid a crash occurring. So in that sense, you can have private arrangements so as to reduce, if everybody in the industry believes that that bank's failure would be a catastrophe for them, then they can try to make precautions in advance. And presumably the way you want to do it is to say, well, if you have a run and you need our help, we're going to charge for it because we don't want to give you an incentive to act riskily. But you could certainly imagine arrangements, and I think some such arrangements have existed, in which it's understood that if one big bank has a run, the other banks will lend it money to let it fulfill its obligations, but on terms such that it pays banks to avoid runs.
Right, that sounds like a rather happy arrangement. My intention was a little bit different. When you externalize, when you have internalized rewards and centralized risks, like we have had, you have operational agents creating very risky, very top-heavy, centralized monsters of institutions. Yeah. Is there something resembling that could happen in in a free market? Nassim Taleb, which I read with interest, seems to think so. That it's either because of cognitive biases in the market actors or for some
So
reason.
how do I externalize the risks in the market?
I don't know. I don't know.
I have not read Taleb's discussion of it, so I don't know what his argument is. He's a bright guy, so he may have a point. But
that's what
it seemed to me that is a sense, of course, in which it always happens with insurance. That's what moral hazard is.
Right.
And that what happens with insurance is that you have a trade-off between the benefits, which might be risk aversion, might be something else, and the costs. And the cost is that when I let my house burn down, the insurance company loses much of the money.
Right.
And we know of the ways in which the private market reduces that cost by they only insure it for 80%, not 100%. And if they insure it for 110%, it's sure to burn down. And they may make conditions of insurance being might have a sprinkler system and so forth. But that I think is not anything new. I mean, that's just a trade-off between costs and benefits. The way I like to put sort of my view of moral hazard is that saying that my insuring my house is a bad thing because it reduces my incentive to protect the house is a little too simple because it increases the insurance company's incentive to protect the house. And there might be cases in which the insurance company could do a better job of it than I could. So the right way of putting it, I think, is to put the risk on whoever can best control it, or divide the risk among people who can control it. So I don't know if that answers the question or not. Other people?
Any other question?